Hello and welcome to Newsbreak Chats. I'm Chai Hosilenia, the editor of Newsbreak, which is the investigative and in-depth section of Rappler. We're on our sixth episode under quarantine with still more relaxed restrictions. Fortunately, the pandemic continues to threaten everyone as cases and deaths continue to rise. Undoubtedly, the pandemic does not deter protests worldwide, and we're still seeing a lot of protesters on the streets. There has been a strong pushback against authoritarianism. We have yet to see, however, where things are headed. Domestically, after the anti-terror law was passed, we've seen at least two activists and human rights workers brutally killed, and this is very recent. What do these events signal for us? Today, I will be joined by Sofia Tomacruz, who has been monitoring the pandemic and related issues. Hi, Sofia.
Hi, Ma'am Chai.
I will also be joined by Paterno Esmaquel, who celebrated his birthday recently and who is manning our local global desk. Hi, Paterno.
Hi, Ma'am Chai.
And Jodes Gavilan, who writes about human rights. I think this is the first time na nag-appear si Jodes sa Newsbreak Chats. Am I correct, Jodes?
Yes, Ma'am Chai. Hello.
Hi. Okay, welcome sa inyong lahat and let's jump into the discussion. Let's start with the pandemic because it's really very pervasive. It's affecting everyone. We don't seem to be in a better place now compared to, say, March 15 when we were first put under quarantine. Am I right or am I wrong, Sophia? Am I missing something here?
You're right, Ma'am Chai. On August 26, we already breached the 200,000 mark. So we're actually at over 200,002 cases. And you have to remember that 5 months ago, when we just went into lockdown and when the pandemic was officially declared as a pandemic, we weren't even at 1,000 cases yet. So just by the sheer number of cases alone, you see how exponential the growth has been. And I think that's one large area that, you can't paint that any other way. As if you try to paint that in any other way, you won't be able to cover the fact that cases have increased by so much. And that's one thing we're still really struggling to do at this point is contain the pandemic. And to be fair, we have improved in many areas. For instance, our testing capacity has in fact increased, but you also have to remember that we're still not testing enough people. The same goes for other responses like contact tracing. Still weak, we still need to catch up on that. And the same thing for treatment, right? A lot of our hospitals, especially in Manila, where the epidemic is, which is the epicenter of the pandemic here in the country, hospitals are still filled to the brim. And I think that's why it's making it so hard to kind of turn the corner on this pandemic. And while other people have been feeling some sense of normalcy, I think the very fact that a lot of people are still under quarantine, still under restrictions, that speaks for itself, right? We haven't been we haven't improved greatly. There's still a lot to do. And so maybe while small
But
things,
if you were to compare the Philippines with other neighboring countries, kahit na ASEAN lang siguro, because those are our closest neighbors, how do we compare, Paterno? Because I know that you've been watching the ASEAN and the international scene quite closely.
As of now, Ma'am Chai, the Philippines is still the country, the Southeast Asian country with the highest number of COVID-19 cases. And it's important for us to see the Philippines in relation also to Indonesia, the country with the second highest number of COVID-19 cases. These two countries in Southeast Asia have to always be seen in tandem because of all the 10 countries in ASEAN, only the Philippines and Indonesia have COVID cases in 6 digits. So the third in the number of COVID cases, Singapore only has 50,000 plus COVID cases. Indonesia has 150,000 plus, and the Philippines has more than 190,000 COVID-19
Close
cases.
to 200,000 na.
Yeah, as of based on this tracker by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, because we have to understand they're trying to compare the countries based on certain baselines, and these countries this is their tracker. And based on this tracker, 197,000, but as of now, of course, it's been updated more than 200,000. But zooming out, we have to understand that the Philippines and Indonesia are employing more or less the same kind of approach towards the pandemic. And that kind of approach is they're a bit more militarized than other Southeast Asian countries. Recently, I did a story about this, and we realized that in Indonesia and the Philippines, the heads of the COVID-19 task forces in both countries are retired or active generals. And that says a lot about how the two countries are viewing the COVID-19 crisis. Many other countries have public health experts as the head of their COVID-19 task force. So here we can see, glean from this piece of information, one possible reason why the Philippines and Indonesia are leading in the number of COVID cases, and this is probably because they're viewing it from a militaristic standpoint, a securitized standpoint, whereas we should employ much more public health, economics, the works. But this one, all about curfew, all about what else? Sophia and Jodes can tell us more about that. But we can see that the Philippines and Indonesia are treating it more as a security problem than a health problem, and that for me is the problem.
Pero hindi ba medyo ironic because the Philippines and Indonesia are democracies, di ba? And yet, ang approach nga is militaristic, as you put it. And then you have countries like Vietnam and Singapore na you would expect na mas stringent and mas strict, and yet they're not tapping their military or their soldiers. What are your thoughts about this, Sophia or si Jodes?
Well, I think, for example, going back to what Paterno said, right? That's what makes our situation so stark, is that it's being handled by a lot of military figures. Whereas, and I think that's something that's a huge loss for us, because the Philippines has a dearth of experts that we can consult. And even if they do play an active role somewhat in crafting policy and crafting strategies and approaches to the pandemic, they're not front and center. And you see in the case of Singapore, for example, or in the case of other Southeast Asian countries, what it means and what the real effects are, and how that is felt by people when you have health experts, public health experts at the helm, because they see things in a different way, naturally, because it's a health problem. They know the importance of communicating properly, what we're supposed to do, how to get people to cooperate, how to get patients to cooperate, and they understand the problem, right? The problem is a disease, and an infectious disease at that, and so they understand how to tackle the approach. Whereas, granted, if you approach it in a militaristic way, that can only work for so long, and it's limited in its approach. And we're seeing that.
Sophia, you've been talking to doctors and health experts, and I'm sure sa pakikipag-usap mo sa kanila, merong sense of frustration din, di ba? Na dapat kami yung nasa front lines, dapat kami yung pinapakinggan, dapat kami yung nagsasabi or nagre-recommenda na dapat ito ang dapat gawin. Pero yun na nga, as Paterno pointed out, sundalo or mga dating generals ang nasa front lines. What's your sense? What have they been telling you?
Well, interestingly, no, Chai, when you talk about when we speak to medical doctors and experts, um, for me, one interesting thing is that they, of course, will always say, we need experts. An expert needs to be at the helm and talking. But at the same time, I think they've moved away from that a little bit, and they're just trying to find spaces where they can work. So whether it be actually smart din kasi, so if it can't be so much on the national level, although they won't let that go. They've gone down to LGUs. They've tapped their network of medical societies in regions and in different communities to just be the one to help advise local government officials who are seeking that information. Also, they're very hungry for the health expertise and guidance from these experts, and so um, of course there's that sense of frustration. But I think as doctors, their nature is to just treat the problem, find the solution, and they found ways to do that, whether it be going down to communities, still speaking to national officials, giving out advice, and urge just all they can do really is just urge the public to follow it. And they've made their voice heard separately na rin. We know that, of course, when they sounded the alarm and tried to tell the government that, hey, we need to pause and review and strengthen our response.
If you think about it, di ba, itong pandemic na to also favors authoritarian governments. Parang it becomes harder to organize protests. It becomes harder to exercise your rights and your freedom. So nakikita natin yan sa Brazil and Belarus and kahit dito sa Pilipinas, no? Hindi ganun kadali mag-organize ng rallies, for example. Jodes, ano yung nakikita mong nakakatakot dito? Or what are your thoughts about this? Yung implications or paggamit ng pandemic sa pag-stifle ng dissent or ng kalayaan ng bawat isa?
Ma'am, when we think about the pandemic, ang nakakausap ko mga human rights groups, ang lagi lang pinipinpoint is, it reminds them of the drug war, na maraming abuses, maraming mga arrests. So, after few months, ganun pa rin. Of course, nakita natin na yung mga guidelines ng mga local lockdown sa mga cities, nag-lead to sa mga mass arrests when the groups try to mobilize. Nangyari ito noong June during the mobilization organized by LGBTQ movement. And then, nandun naman yung mga arrests sa mga jeepney drivers who wanted to voice out concerns about the lack of support for them. So, parang, sa puso pa nila yung ganitong lumabas at mag-protest, pero nasa taas ng head nila yung worry na, baka ma-arrest kami, mahuli kami. And we know naman the situation inside the prisons, the jails, na COVID-19 time bomb sila doon. Just yesterday or this week, nakita natin na yung paralegal who guarded the body of recently slain activist Randall Lechanis ay nag-test positive. And he only spent like a week sa jail. So, siguro overall, makikita natin na hindi nag-stop yung attacks, yung harassment, yung threats against dissent, human rights groups, activists, and even the ordinary people expressing their thoughts online. Mas, if I dare say it, mas nag-intensify ito kasi hindi na lang sila on the ground. The attacks, the threats are also trying to dominate the online conversation. We recently released a report na nag-red tag ang mga FB pages na align with police stations, which is very dangerous. So, people are getting tagged as communists, as terrorists. Pero at the same time, dito pumapasok yung power siguro ng social media na the groups are also embracing social media kasi we see everyday pag nagkakaroon ng issue kay President Duterte, nag-trend yung mga oust Duterte, yung mga creative ways to oust the turtle pa nga, diba? So parang it's a fight against narrative online. But at the same time, hindi tumitigil yung on-the-ground protests. Nag-document pa rin ng abuses yung mga human rights groups, especially in the aftermath of the anti-terror law. Pero parang, what they report to me is, nag-intensify pa rin yung tagging. Yung parang,
bago tayo pumunta sa anti-terror law, kasi nabanggit mo lang yung mga nakikita mong patterns na nagpupunta sa social media, ganyan. So, curious lang ako, tatalon lang muna ako kay Paterno. Nakikita mo rin ba yung similar effect na, kunyari, nabanggit natin ang Brazil at saka Belarus, no? Parang kung sa Pilipinas ang nagiging outlet ng protesters and ng dissenters, social media, ano naman yung nangyayari dito sa dalawang bansang ito, Brazil and Belarus, from what you've seen?
Interesting yung mga nakikita nating mga larawan sa Belarus at sa Thailand ngayon. Kasi talaga nagpo-protesta sila, dikit-dikit talaga, mga nakamask nga lang. Pero tuloy pa rin yung paglalabas nila ng mga sama ng loob sa gobyerno. Sa Belarus, gusto pa nilang patalsikin si Alexander Lukashenko na 26 years na ang nandun sa kapangyarihan. Ngayon, babalikan ko lang yung tanong ni Ma'am Chay 2 questions ago, yung democracy. Kasi mahalaga nating mapag-usapan yan na yung bang democracy ay nakakasama dito sa pandemic. Meron akong 3 halimbawa na ibibigay, ilalatag lang muna bago ko sabihin yung sagot. Una, yung bansa kung saan nanggaling yung COVID-19, China. Yun ba ay isang democracy? Yung Pilipinas, na napakataas ng number of COVID cases at highest in Southeast Asia, democracy ang tawag natin doon. Pero yun ba ay totoong democracy? O authoritarianism disguised as democracy? Sa Vietnam, na gawa nilang kontrolin yung COVID-19. Demokrasya ba ang Vietnam? Hindi. Ang New Zealand, nagawa nilang kontrolin. Demokrasya ang New Zealand. Ang Taiwan, demokrasya. So, makikita natin na walang kinalaman yung demokrasya o hindi demokrasya doon sa pagkalat ng COVID-19. Siguro, ang nakukita ko dito, ito bang mga demokrasya at ito bang mga authoritarian governments gumagamit ng utak? Yun ang tanong natin eh. Gumagamit ba ng utak at gumagamit ba ng siyensya? Kasi po pwede kang demokrasya kung gumagamit ka kung demokrasya ka pero hindi ka gumagamit ng utak, panay dahas lang ang ginagamit mo at panay forma, walang siyensya. Hindi mo makokontrol. Pero kung authoritarian government ka, pero gumagamit ka rin ng utak, gaya ng iba-ibang bansa na hindi naman demokrasya, gaya nga ng banggit ko, yung Vietnam. Pero gumagamit sila ng utak. Yun ang tanong eh. Kung gumagamit ba ng utak yung pamahalaan, demokrasya man o hindi. So, yun yung masasagot ko naman dun sa unang tanong ni Ma'am Chay tungkol dun sa demokrasya. Tingin ko, hindi siya nagmamatter, pero ang nagmamatter, gumagamit ka ba ng utak mo o puro ka forma at puro ka akas?
Sige. So, yung isang kapansin-pansin din, dito naman sa sitwasyon ng Pilipinas, bukod sa pandemic, bukod sa lideratong hindi gumagamit ng datos at saka ng siyensya, sabi nga ni Paterno, meron pa tayong anti-terror law. So, parang mas sumisikip, mas mahirap yung sitwasyon ng mga tao siguro na hindi masaya dun sa response ng gobyerno. Ano ang impact nito na meron pang anti-terror law dun sa mga aktivista at sa mga grupo na siguro critical of the administration, Jodes?
I will always remember yung quote ng isang human rights activist na nakausap ko. Sabi niya sa akin, iba yung atake, iba sa feeling yung atake before the anti-terror law, after anti-terror law. Kasi before the anti-terror law, okay, you're tagged as a communist. Hindi naman illegal maging komunista sa Pilipinas. But after the anti-terror law, nandun kasi diba yung narrative ng government na if you're CPP, NPA, you're a terrorist. So parang sila, anytime na feel nila na pwede silang arestuhin. At the same time, hindi unfounded yung mga kanilang mga feelings, mga fears. Kasi makikita natin sa mga province, lalo na sa province, anito yung mga posters, mga tarpaulins na outright with their pictures, with their names, with their associations, calling them as terorista. Hindi na lang komunista terorista. Terorista, number 1 recruiter ng CPP-NPA. Tapos mag-iisip ka, sila, paano nakakapag-hang ng mga posters to kung naka-strict lockdown ang, kunyari, Baguio? Paano nangyayari yung kung hindi nakikita ng mga police? So they can only, like, imagine ko sinong behind doon. Sabi nila sa akin, natatakot sila na itong anti-terror law ay, sa kanila kasi wala silang problema, kasi alam nila yung paninindigan nila, kung ano yung kailangan nilang gawin. Pero paano yung mga iba na nasa paligid nila na gusto nilang parang mahikayat na mag-speak up? Kasi of course, we're in a democracy na protected dapat ng constitution yung freedom of expression, of speech. Pero if you have this law na nakikita mo na sila, they're just talking, calling out the government, nare-red tag sila, and then we see yung mga statement ng mga military generals na just this week may nagsasabi na baka ma-cover ng ang social media ng anti-terror law, dapat daw isama sa IRR yung social media. So matatakot, parang nagkakaroon ng prior restraint, nagkakaroon ng parang spiral of silence na imbes na mas lumawak yung dissent sa Pilipinas, naka-clamp down sila dahil sa anti-terror law. So parang the human rights groups see this na hindi directly impact them. Of course, may mga threats sa kanila, pero mas maka-impact ito sa kakayanan ng mga tao mag-express ng dissent na necessarily yung mga hindi mga affiliated. Like, for example, yung mga ordinary citizens, yun po yung parang nakita nilang one of the most direct impact ng anti-terror law sa Pilipinas.
Meron ka na bang latest updates about, di ba recently lang nilibing si Zara, no? Kamusta naman yung kay Chinese? Parang meron ka bang nababalita ang latest developments? At ano yung mangyayari dito sa mga kasong to? May mangyayari pa ba na pwedeng asahan?
When we think of the latest victim, si Randall Chinese ng anak pa and si Bares na isang long-time Negros human rights defenders, ang common sa kanila is red tag sila even before pa. Over the past 4 years, tatag sila as communists. Si Zara Alvarez na napasama pa nga sa initial list ng DOJ, diba, na gusto nilang itag as terrorist. So, parang nakakita ng mga families nila, ng colleagues nila na itong pagpatay sa kanila, it's a parang culmination of the long years of attacks, harassment. So, ang latest development ay wala sa investigation side. Of course, sabihin ng mga police ay nag-iimbestiga sila. Pero yung lumabas, especially kay Randall Chinese sa autopsy, na nakita ni forensic pathologist Raquel Fortun na sa autopsy niya na si Echanis ay nagkaroon ng 40 stab wounds. So basically, and then meron pang force blunt trauma sa ulo niya. So hindi talaga siya muna pinatay. So it was short of saying na tinorture siya. Pero hindi kasi pwedeng ma-determine sa autopsy kung tortured siya. Pero there was intent na pahirapan muna siya bago siya patayin. Tapos parang, so iisipin mo, saan ka nang gagaling para gawin yung ganong kadahas sa isang 70-plus-year-old na matanda, na isang long-time reform advocate. And then si Zara Alvarez naman ay binaril siya 3 beses, tapos nung nakalapag na siya sa kalsada, tinapos siya, finish her off by the unknown assailant. Wala pa ring mga napipinpoint na dahilan or mapipinpoint ng mga suspects sa dalawang kaso na ito. Pero of course, if you look at their history, their involvement, politically motivated. And parang isipin natin na itong dalawang to ay dagdag to sa listahan ng 100 plus na mga human rights defenders activists na pinatay since 2016. And if you look at those numbers, until now, wala pa rin significant development sa investigations. Yung Department of Justice, sinasabi nila na nag-investigate sila dahil nga meron task force dapat for politically motivated killings. Pero wala pa rin significant updates. Kaya ang mga human rights groups ay umaasa na lang sa mga investigation ng mga independent or kaya international probes like sa United Nations Human Rights Council. we have to remember na itong killings ng activists, they exist alongside thousands killed in a drug war by either police or vigilante killers. Also, we have to remember na may 40 plus ng mga lawyers na pinatay since 2016 alone. And that's also on top of the local executive killed like the mayors, the vice mayors in several municipalities and towns in the Philippines. Titingnan mo, ano na nangyari sa mga kaso na to? Walang significant, walang na-invest much more sa thousands killed in the drug war. So parang word groups are coming from na nawawalan sila ng pag-asa sa local mechanism. And so, ano nang mangyari ngayon? So, titingin tayo sa international mechanisms. And we yet to see kasi nakabimbin pa yung sa IC, nakabimbin pa yung possible na nangyari doon.
So, from yung description mo, parang we're in this dark spot, dark hole na parang masamang panaginip, di ba? Do you see any bright spots whatsoever kahit na katiting? I don't know, maybe Sophia, because at least yung health workers, yung mga doktor natin, they're okay, no? Pero if you look at human rights talaga and the activists, parang walang optimism na pagkukunan doon eh. So, do you see any source of hope, Sophia?
Well, Ma'am Chay, babalik yun sa sinabi ni Paterno kanina, no? So he mentioned the question, gumagamit ba ng mga leaders yung datos, science, and everything, but I think that also, if we're asking, are there any bright spots, are there any hopes, that also depends on what the priorities are. Ano ba yung prioridad ng mga officials? Is it curbing the infections, or is it, pushing for things like the anti-terror law? Is it shrinking space for dissent and everything? Kasi when we ask that question, that's where the next few months, I think, that's what the next few months will largely depend on, what the priorities are. Kasi ngayon, when we look at it, parang ang haba na ng pandemic people are either getting used to it, feeling a little bit more comfortable, or just tired, fatigued. And so that's dangerous because the fact is, it's not over. And I think that largely depends on what the priorities are. But I think just to add a little bit of hope to it, there are still, of course, what I'm hopeful in is in the fact that we can count on our health workers, for example, to keep treating patients, to keep reminding people, hey, wear a mask, hey, wear face shields, hey, practice physical distancing, don't forget to wash your hands. Very rudimentary, basic, quote-unquote, low-tech things, but I mean, they work, right? And at the same time, we can count on them, like good workers, to keep finding solutions, to keep reacting, to not get tired, to not let themselves get tired, even if the pandemic drags on, and to do the research and the science and look at all these different developments like vaccines, although still far off pa yun, mga 2021 at the earliest. And at the same time, perhaps a bright spot can be if we embrace what they're saying, and instead of listening to, and not letting things like the shrinking space for dissent and the clampdown of democracy in the Philippines, hinder what we can do to help ourselves, like, following those health protocols and everything. So I guess the bright spot would be maybe that people will listen to experts and people who are worth listening to, rather than, letting the clampdown really silence them.
Paterno?
Pagdating dun sa bright spots, makikita kasi natin na dito sa mga bansa na may mga populist leader, meron silang isang thing in common eh. Itong mga populist leader na ito ay creation ng social media, creation ng big tech, creation ng manipulation ng mga data ng mga tao. At ngayon, dito sa pandemic na ito, nakikita natin na lahat yon ilusyon. Nakikita natin na itong mga ginawa ng pinakitang imahe nila sa social media, deadly pala. Nakakapagbagsak pala ng ekonomiya, nakakapatay pala ng tao, nakakapagpalagana pala ng COVID-19. So, una, nasi-shatter yung illusion ng social media na ginawa tungkol dyan sa mga populist leader na yan. At pangalawa, maalala natin na through history, ang isang nagtutulak sa mga revolusyon, yung mga economic downturn. Nakita natin yan nung panahon ni Ferdinand Marcos sa Pilipinas. Nung bumaliktad, nung bumabagsak yung ekonomiya, bakit doon nakaramdam yung mga tao na magalit? Nakikita din natin yan ngayon sa Belarus. Kahit sinasabi natin na dinaya yung eleksyon at sinasabi ng maraming eksperto na totoong dinaya yung eleksyon. Pero matagal nang dumadaos-dos daw yung ekonomiya ng Belarus. So makikita natin na shatter yung social media myth tungkol dito sa mga populist leaders, kagaya ni Duterte sa Pilipinas. At yung ekonomiya ng mga bansa, medyo naapektuhan na. So makikita natin na ito yung mga elements na yung mga tao, medyo nakikita natin namumulat na ng kaunti at nagagalit. Yan yung mahalaga na nakikita natin ngayon. Ngayong pandemic, nare-recover yung sense of anger ng mga tao na dati na overshadow lang, na-gloss over lang ng social media. So yun yung isa sa mga bright spot na yung mga tao medyo marunong na magalit. Kasi dati hindi. So yan yung isang bright spot from my end.
Okay. Maganda yung punto mo about the unmasking and the shattering of illusion. No? So parang I guess ito rin yung isang pinakamalaking problema ng administrasyon na to. Kasi hindi mo makontrol. Una, hindi na-expect, nobody expected na magkakaroon ng pandemic. Nobody expected na ganito kalawak yung epekto ng pandemic. Hindi lang sa Pilipinas, hindi lang sa Metro Manila, but nationwide. And hindi lang nationwide, worldwide pa. So kung talagang hindi ka mahusay na pinuno, kung ang expertise mo lang ay pang-local, ma-unmask na talaga yon. Kaya lang, yun na nga, whether magta-translate yung galit na nakikita natin on social media to something on the ground is something else, di ba? Hindi tayo nakakasigurado na yung dating hindi natin nakikita, yung galit na nandun sa Twitter and sa Facebook ay magre-resulta sa mobilization on the ground. Kasi nga, sinabi ni Jodes kanina, di ba, na nandun talaga yung fear. Nandun yung fear na yon. So, ikaw, Jodes, ano ba yung nakikita mong kailangang gawin despite the fear that's there? Ano yung pwedeng gawin ng civil society, ng mga estudyante, ng lawyers, kahit na hindi very hopeful yung judicial system din natin. Ano yung pwede nilang gawin to make sure that we survive this despite siguro yung mismanagement nga ng mga nasa pamahalaan ngayon.
One thing that we need to do is to continue to bring forward yung mga narratives na to on the ground, yung mga attacks sa mga human rights workers, sa discourse natin everywhere. May it be social media, among our friends. Kasi pag continue natin na ipaalam sa mga circles natin na ganito yung nangyayari on the ground, mawawala yung parang efforts ng mga trolls, ng mga sino mang aligned sa status quo sa government na alisin yung ganitong sitwasyon na nangyayari sa Philippines. Na parang, kasi parang naisip ko, kasi I've covered the human rights field since 2016. So makita mo from then, diba, coming from the demonizing from the president, nakita ko recently na marami na rin mga concerns, yung maraming mga non-affiliated na nagpapahayag ng concerns sa mga activists, sa mga
nangyayari sa mga activists. So if we continue that ganyang mga conversations online man lang, na nasa lockdown tayo, masusurvive natin siguro yung pandemic na to, and of course, masusurvive natin itong 6-year, what we said na enders, the decline of democracy, the lawlessness. Siguro, hindi natin sure man kung this year may mangyayaring malaki na magkakaroon ng sudden change. Pero if we to be vigilant to monitor what's happening, naisipin natin na magbabago pa ba to? Wag nating hintayin na magbabago yung perception ng government when it comes to situation. Ang isipin natin dapat is, ako as a person, hindi man ako journalist, hindi man ako aktivista, may part ako dito sa nangyayaring movement, slow man, malaki, or whatever. Pag continue ako naging part doon, eventually may mangyayari. And we're hoping for better things to happen in the next few months, hopefully sooner.
Sophia, how about you?
Well, I think one thing that we should do, for example, is it bears repeating, to let experts take the lead, to let when it comes to the pandemic, to let health experts take the lead. Kasi sila naman yung may alam kung paano i-attack yung pandemic and ano yung kailangang gawin para mag-curb yung mga infections. And at the same time, to keep following their advice, to let their advice be front and center of our response, and to go back to what we said earlier, to get our priorities straight, to use our heads, to look at the data and the science. And I think that's really what will help us survive. Kasi mahaba pa itong pandemya, as the WHO has said.
Your last question na lang. Okay, what do you think should be done? What should be prioritized if we were to put our house in order and government really focused and parang made a very, very clear, ito yung dapat natin gawin, and I don't know, especially as we approach na 2022, no? So next year, 2021, sabi nila, whatever budget will be in place, it will be an election budget, and people will start preparing for elections. Should government reprioritize health first before the economy? Or tama ba na, kasi mukhang ngayon ang priority is open up the economy first because people need jobs, and kung wala kang kinikita, then mamamatay ka sa gutom. Ano yung thoughts nyo doon? Or dapat ba hindi lang rights, hindi lang health, but even human rights?
Parang, ma'am, para sa akin, nagagawa nila na attack ng mga human rights workers, magpasa ng anti-terror law. So what's parang keeping them from finding the right balance sa health and economy? So parang bakit wag kayo mag-prioritize ng mag-implement ng anti-terror law na alam naman natin na okay, on paper baka okay siya for terrorism na isang problema talaga. Pero yung nangyayari naman hindi ganun eh. So why don't you don't focus on that. Go back to the drawing board, and yung mga resources na binibigay ninyo sa mga movement, sa task force na nag-red tag ng mga tao online, gamitin mo yan sa pagdadagdag ng ayuda, pagdadagdag ng mga test kits sa mga municipality, hindi yung parang yung mga maliit na budget na lang ibibigay mo pa sa mga task force na parang walang ginawa kundi mag-attack ng mga tao online. Parang, okay, ina-attack mo yung mga tao online. Ano nangyayari? Nababawas ba ang mga may COVID sa Pilipinas? Dumadami ba ang capacity natin on testing? Hindi. So, parang dapat nila isipin yung priority nila na alisin mo muna yung attacks. Doon ka muna mag-focus sa health and economy kasi I'm sure you will be able to find a balance kung hindi ka lang tutok dun sa mga irrelevant things.
I agree with what Jodez said, no? At going back to what you said din, ma'am, 2021 will be the election budget. But at the same time, it was just released yesterday, right? We already know what the priorities are. Kasi, for example, health, it's not the top of the budget. DepEd is, understandably, kasi largest government agency sila, but not even second, third, fourth, or fifth. Health still came after defense and Department of Interior and local government, which also includes the police. And I think if there's one concrete thing that we can do is to prioritize the right thing and back that up with the funds to be able to do that, right? To be able to do what's necessary to both reopen the economy and to, put people's health first. Kasi sabi din ng mga health experts, it's not a either or thing. It's not mutually exclusive. For you to keep opening the economy, you need your people to stay healthy. And for, that cherishing lives and putting importance in lives includes that aspect of livelihood. And at the same time, granted na it's also an election budget, I think it would be good to remember that 2022, when elections come, people will remember how we spent our money, where we spent it, what the response was like. So even if you fund all the things you want to fund, I mean, at the end of the day, when people go to the polls and make their votes, they'll make their votes count, and they'll remember how the response was like during the pandemic.
Fair, no? Final thoughts?
Napapag-usapan kanina yung 2022 election sa Pilipinas. Ngayong November, magkakaroon na naman ng isang mahalagang eleksyon at ito mangyayari sa Estados Unidos. Bakit mahalaga yung Amerika? At ito-toss ko na ito para sa mga susunod na episode ng Newsbreak Chats siguro. Mahalagang pag-usapan natin yung papel ng Amerika. Alam niyo, maraming kasalanan yung Amerika sa mundo, ha? Sa Afghanistan, sa Iraq, yung panggigera, pati yung Budaho massacre dito sa Mindanao sa atin, napakaraming kasalanan ng Amerika. Pero hindi natin maitatanggi na pagkatapos ng World War II, ang talagang may leadership role sa mundo ay Estados Unidos. Ito ang meron tayo eh. Kaya mahalagang tutukan natin sa konteksto rin ng pandemyang ito at sa konteksto ng mga pag-aatake sa human rights ngayong pandemya. Mahalaga malaman natin, matutukan natin kung sino yung magiging sunod na US President. Bakit? Kasi mahalaga na yung tinuturing nating leader ng free world, na yung tinuturing natin na keeper, guardian of democracy across the globe, napaka-contested niyan. Pero alam niyo yan yung meron tayo eh. At kung yung Amerika magulo sa ngayon, ito ay isang klase ng Amerika na nagwi-withdraw sa UN Human Rights Council. Ito ay isang klase ng Amerika na nagtitreten mag-withdraw mula sa World Health Organization. At sila ang nagpopondo ng malaki sa WHO, lalo na ngayong pandemya. Mahalaga na matutukan natin yung Estados Unidos dahil nakasalalay pa rin ng malaki sa US yung mga susunod na mangyayari dito sa pandemic na ito. Tingnan natin. Wala tayong makita na isang clear leader ang mundo. Tinatawag natin itong pandemic. Ibig sabihin, buong mundo, pandemic. Pero nasaan ang world leadership? Wala. Watak-watak. Kasi ang Amerika parang inabandona sa ilalim ni Donald Trump yung mga pinagmamalaki nilang democratic ideals na hindi naman palaging totoo. Pero mahalaga na ibandera natin yan. Pero kahit yung pagbabandera, itinapon ni Trump. So mahalaga na tutukan natin yung US elections dahil malaking bagay yung nakasalalay sa Amerika kahit dito sa pandemic na ito.
Palagay ko hindi matutuwa sa iyo ang Republicans. Anyway, maraming salamat sa inyong thoughts and contributions. Talagang mahaba pa itong pandemyang ito, and you're right, no? Parang sana by next year kung meron ng vaccine at sana kung magkaroon ng totoong mahusay na leadership, makalabas na tayo sa Hall of Shame sa ASEAN, and mas maayos yung maging standing natin among nations, di ba? So what we're seeing really is this pandemic has been a test of leadership. And sabi nga, sana huwag makalimutan ng mga tao ito in 2022. Because kung ang drug war, nakalusot yan, maraming namatay, pero okay lang kasi hindi naman ako ang namatay, hindi ko naman kamag-anak yung namatay. Pero dito, sa pandemyang ito, marami talaga ang namatay at maraming kamag-anak ang namatay at mga kakilala. So, ganon parang it has to be close to home before it really affects you. And hopefully, hindi nga makalimutan ng mga tao yung leadership yung quality of leadership that we're seeing at the present time. So thank you very much, and madami pang pag-uusapan. Hopefully, the seventh episode, ang suspetsya ko, quarantine pa rin tayo But thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Jodes. Thank you, Paterno, and thank you, Sophia, for being a part of this interesting discussion. And I'm Shai Hoselenia. This is Newsbreak Chats.